people like sports gambling. They're not concerned about the other problems, in part because I think, that's a part of the larger discussion we're having. It's an atomization issue, right? Gambling addiction is something that happens to other people. But like the ultimate result here for me is a situation in which everything is being degraded.
Hello and welcome to Tech Won't Save Us, made in partnership with The Nation magazine. I'm your host, Marx. And before we get into this week's episode, just a reminder that this month, April, is our 4th birthday. It's 4 years of making this show from way back in the pandemic lockdown days to here where we are today. More than 200 episodes into making the show. It's kind of incredible. And to celebrate that, we are trying to get 200 new supporters, or, if you're an existing supporter, you can upgrade your tier of support over on patreon.com. And if we hit that goal, we are going to make a special series digging into the AI hype of the past year and a half, the data centers that power all of those AI tools, the increasing energy and water use and other resources that go into making this, and the growing backlash that is happening to these technologies and to these data centers in particular, as larger and larger data centers are having to be built in more and more parts of the world in order to power these computational tools that these major tech companies want to roll out, and that have major consequences that they do not want us to think about. Ultimately, that leads us to ask, how much computation do we really need? And is the amount that these tech companies are trying to push on us the amount that we actually need to build a better world? I would say no, and that's what this series will explore. Right now, we still have a bit of a ways to go in order to get our goal. We're doing quite well so far, but we still need your support. To go over to patreon.com/techwon'tsavus to become a supporter at $5 a month or above. You can get some stickers, you can get a shout out on the show, you can get access to premium episodes that we did from our last special series about Elon Musk in October. The full version of the interviews that we did for the guests of that series are available for paying supporters. So if you want all of that and to help us hit our goal so we can make this special series on AI hype and data centers, make sure to go to patreon.com/techwon'tsavus and become a supporter. And of course, that will also make sure that Tech Won't Save Us is sustainable and we can keep making this for a long time to come. Now, with that said, this week's guest is Alex Shephard. Alex is a senior editor at The New Republic, and he recently wrote a piece about sports gambling and how much these gambling apps like DraftKings and FanDuel have increasingly become part of sports and just how it works in the United States since it's been legalized in 2018. How much that is changing the way sports are done, the way sports are broadcasted, the way sports are reported about, but also what it means for the fans of sports who are engaging in it and are now being increasingly pressured and incentivized to get into gambling to a much greater degree than they used to in the past, and how that is leading to a real epidemic and crisis of gambling addiction as a result of this, because of the types of people that these apps are targeting. That also leads to serious questions about the sports themselves and the integrity of those sports, as you have these incentives to push people to gamble, but also when you're making bets on different ways that the game could play out, there are incentives there, of course, to try to change the way that the game is played so that certain bets become more likely to succeed over others. So there are a lot of serious and important questions here. We touched on the problem of sports gambling last year with Ed Ongwezo Jr. when we talked about the financialization of everything, but I thought that this was a topic that deserved its own specific attention. As you can tell from the interview when we get into it, I am not a big sports person myself. I'm not someone who watches the sports. Don't have a favorite team or anything like that. But I've certainly seen, my grandfather or my father watching sports on TV. I've seen the way that sports betting has increasingly worked its way into the way that sports are presented. And of course, even just as someone who doesn't watch sports a lot, I've heard a lot of ads for things like DraftKings and FanDuel on other podcasts and in other media, because these businesses have just become so significant in the past few years and are hard to dislodge because so many people are making money off of them, even if they're not, the gamblers who directly engage with them. And that makes it difficult to actually tackle this problem. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. I had a great time speaking with Alex and learning more about this whole field of things that he's talking about. Because as I say, there's a lot on the sports side of things that I'm not super familiar with. So I hope you enjoy this conversation as well. If you are a sports fan, I hope you feel that I did this topic justice, even though I'm not watching sports all the time like some people. And I certainly don't mean that as a dig, just to be clear. Totally fine if you watch sports. It's just not my thing. So with that said, if you like this week's episode, and if you just enjoy the show in general and the critical conversations that we have on here, I would ask you to go to patreon.com/tech-won't-save-us this month to become a supporter and help us hit our goal. In doing so, you can join supporters like Nathan from the UK, Peter from Sweden, Sylvia in Calgary, Matt in London, UK, Aka in Cape Town, South Africa, JPC from Chicago, Blaine from Texas, and Brigitte Jonsdottir in Reykjavik, Iceland. Thanks so much to those supporters and the hundreds of others supporting the show over on Patreon. And with that said, enjoy this week's conversation. Alex, welcome to Tech Won't Save Us.
It's good to be here.
Great to speak with you. You have this new piece in the New Republic digging into this increasingly large problem of sports gambling. And of course, anyone who watches sports regularly or even occasionally will have seen how much these apps like DraftKings and FanDuel have become prevalent throughout these sports. You know, even if you're not someone who regularly watches sports, you might just see it advertised on other shows or on podcasts that you listen to because these ways of betting on these games have become so common. So I wanted to start with where this really came from, because I feel like 10 years we didn't see so much of this. So why has it become so common recently?
Yeah, so basically there was a law that was passed in 1992 that essentially banned states from creating their own laws regulating sports gambling, right? And it effectively banned all forms of sports betting in the country. There are certain, I think, casinos that may have had it, but for the most part, if you wanted to bet on sports, you had to go to a bookie or use a kind of, offshore account somewhere. Basically what happened was that in 2018, New Jersey had been sort of suing to try to legalize sports betting effectively. And in 2018, the Supreme Court ruled that the law that had banned sports betting was unconstitutional. The way that we've seen kind of conservative Supreme Court do again and again, it just sort of kicked issues that had been regulated by the federal government in some way back to the states. And since then, there's just been a total explosion. New Jersey was first because they had sued. They were basically ready to rock as soon as this law was passed. I think here in New York, I could take the train to the Meadowlands and did a couple of times to place bets, I think, as early as 2019. But, basically by the end of the pandemic, or the, quote unquote end of the pandemic, there were laws that had passed to legalize betting in dozens of states. Right now it's at 38 plus Washington, D.C. So, I think in theory, what you had was a situation in which, it was a kind of classic states' rights issue, right? A classic kind of dry constitutional problem. But the states wanted to legalize sports betting because it's a revenue generator, right? You can tax the hell out of it and you can make a ton of money, right? So when this ruling came down, I think the estimates were that, it could open up something like $150 billion nationally. And you basically see a steady increase, up to close to that number now, just in the intervening 5 years. And, for the most part, there are some restrictions depending on the state. But, for the most part, if you want to gamble on sports, I think the thing that the Supreme Court probably didn't consider at the time was that you didn't need to go to a casino anymore, right? That you could just do everything, on your phone. And I think that that's been actually the shift that I don't even think that, when I was reading through some of the coverage at the time, that people didn't quite anticipate happening, that what you've seen is an explosion, yes, at sports books. And you can even go to some arenas, right, where there is an actual sports book in the lobby somewhere. But for the most part, if you want to bet, if I want to bet on sports here in New York, I can, load DraftKings on my phone or FanDuel. And then various casinos, MGM being the biggest one, also have their own sports books as well. But what you've seen is a really fast embrace of sports gambling, both by states, but also by what are essentially tech companies that have gamified sports betting even more than it already is, right? So the explosion of kind of like prop bets in particular is a big one. Those are extraordinarily profitable for gambling companies because they don't hit very often. And if you're doing individual prop bets, you're almost always going to lose money. And you're very rarely going to make a lot of money. And that's sort of like where the door got kicked open here, I guess, is that, all of a sudden in 2018, if I was watching, let's say, Liverpool versus Manchester United or the Knicks versus the, Atlanta Hawks, I would just be watching the game. I might be looking at Twitter or something, but now I can watch it and say, I'm going to, I think that Mitchell Robinson's going to get more than 11 and a half rebounds in this game. And Josh Hart's going to hit X amount of threes. And all of a sudden you're watching the game differently. For states, there was a push here because essentially it's, free tax revenue. So you don't have to think about difficult things like, let's say, here in New York, state and local taxes are a huge deal, right? So you can kick that to the curb. But for sports leagues, I think, and this is another thing that was not anticipated in 2018 when this happened, essentially there was a sort of hockey stick curve in terms of revenue from TV deals. And part of that was based on the assumption of globalization, right? That you could open up new markets. So if you're the NBA, you're looking at China. China's got 1 billion people, right? So you're selling TV rights on the presumption that you're going to have this huge explosion of money coming in. And for cable companies, for a long time, sports was like the most important moat, right? That if you want to keep people locked in, right? Like if I want to watch the Super Bowl, I can't go anywhere else for it, right? I have to have a TV and, a connection somewhere. But what you've seen is, I think, with the rise of the Netflix model, there's been a huge surge in cord cutting that has diminished the ability for sports leagues to sell their TV rights to other companies and to create these kinds of bidding wars, right? You had a situation, for instance, last year in which the Women's World Cup, which is a huge event, growing in popularity, in a lot of countries, they were struggling to sell TV rights to it. So for leagues that, require constant influxes of money, sports gambling also provided a new revenue stream at a time that it was desperately needed. And I think those two things there's been a confluence there, right? That states want the money, sports leagues want the money. And so what you've seen is just this huge exponential rise almost every year. And with that, which we'll talk about in a second, an explosion of social problems as well that I think have not been thought through at all.
Yeah, that's fascinating to hear. And unfortunately not surprising, but also very disappointing, especially when we started to get into the broader effects. There are a number of things I want to pick up on there, but you talk in particular, and I feel like DraftKings and FanDuel are the big ones, but you can of course inform me if there are other kind of key ones there. Were these companies that were, already kind of ready to go in 2018 when this Supreme Court decision was decided in order to kick it back to the states, and so the states could start legalizing it in the way that they have, or are these companies that really kind of saw the opportunity of 2018 and then launched after that? And does the fact that a lot of these bets are being placed through apps and through these tech companies, does that diminish the amount of revenue that states potentially receive from it? Or does it not really matter in that case?
This is where I'm not an expert fully, but I believe that what happened was that DraftKings is American and was founded essentially in 2012, again, with the assumption that sports betting was going to come, gamified, appified sports betting was going to come. FanDuel was started in Europe, where sports betting has been endemic for a very long time, and particularly in the UK, or at least that's the area in which I have the most sort of knowledge or expertise of it and experience. And so FanDuel was started, I think, in Scotland, and it quickly merged with sort of Paddy Power, which is the big sports book in the UK. Again, the assumption was that this was going to come to the US at some point. And I think basically what you saw was by the end of 2018, they were really ready. So DraftKings and FanDuel started to really advertise heavily in the US in 2015, 2016, slowly sort of built up with the getting ready essentially to take over the online sports betting here in the US. And, in terms of the principle of it, it's not that different from the way that you would bet on sports 40 years ago, right? Like there too, you would have an odds maker and they would, usually have some form of expertise that they would use to screw you over in some way. But I think what you've seen now, which is the big shift, is just that it is so easy to do. And, they were essentially using the exact same kind of tech that you see in social media and, even things like Candy Crush or something to essentially be nudging you all the time. And at the same time, I think the advertising strategy has been really aggressive. If there was a long period in which you couldn't watch sports, listen to sports media, engage with sports media and not just be constantly bombarded with offers of free money, essentially, so you still get them now. It's a little less, but, where it's essentially like, oh, we'll match, you give us $1,000, we'll give you $1,000, right? And obviously that money stays in your account. So you have to keep gambling from it. That's more or less how it started. But I think there was another element as well, which again is something we should probably get into a little bit later, which is that obviously it's not a particularly great time for the media industry. And I think sports media in particular has really struggled for a long time. Local newspapers, or even larger regional newspapers were a kind of hotbed of where you would get information about the Knicks or whatever. There's been a huge contraction in that type of coverage, and the advertising money has just been completely destroyed by Google and Facebook. So companies like The Athletic, which was founded in the mid 2010s and was purchased by the New York Times a few years ago, partly as a way to get rid of their unionized sports section, which they successfully did last year, which was evil. When you look at that kind of coverage, what you see, it's all sports betting stuff, like all the time. Everything is sponsored by FanDuel, right? Shams Charania, who's the sort of big scoop guy for The Athletic, he has a kind of video show that I think is sponsored by FanDuel, right? And, for a long time I couldn't listen to it because The Athletic's, sort of flagship soccer podcast, which was started by a bunch of guys who used to be at The Guardian, that was also sponsored by Paddy Power. And like when you listen to it, you were just constantly being overwhelmed with offers to bet. But what you've really seen, and I think this has been over the last 2 years, is like on TV and in media in particular, it's just people are just talking about gambling all the time. And it's sponsored by everything. And that I think has been one of the sort of insidious like creep elements here, where you've just seen this sort of slow rise, this slow infection essentially of gambling in sports itself, so that if you're watching baseball now, you see a win probability like thing, which is stupid because, the win probability is the score, right? If the Mets are up 4-0, you're going to say, well, the Mets are winning. They're probably going to win. But that too is like, I think where you're seeing this kind of shift, right? It merges with the rise in analytics in sports as well, but it's a nudge. And, again, like, if I have ESPN on, which I sometimes do while I'm working, right, you get the lines all the time, right? So Heat versus the Hawks, right? Over under 190.5 points or something. It'd be more than that, but 212.5, let's say. That I think has been one of the more interesting elements here, is that as we've come out of the zero interest rate era, is that the ads on podcasts have shifted, right? So it used to be that you have a company that say, we're going to disrupt the underwear industry, right? And investors were like, well, screw it. We have free money, so we will invest in the underwear company. That money is gone now. And like, when I listen to Bill Simmons or whatever, I'm not hearing about disruptions to food service or disruptions to clothing or disruptions to analog radios. I don't know. What I'm hearing is two things. One is a return to just sort of more ordinary advertisements, like listening to Simmons, right? He's advertising Shell gas and like cars or something. But the one exception here is sports gambling, right? That's the sort of one tech company that is doing it. And it's because, they know that if they can get people on board, they're kind of stuck there for a really long time.
I wanted to ask you about how the introduction of sports betting changes the way that the game is presented. And I hadn't even considered the aspect of, the media industry itself has been in a lot of trouble. The advertising has been declining. And so you need these new revenue sources to bring it in. And so the introduction of sports betting then provides this whole new revenue stream, not just for the leagues and not just for the state and local governments and people like that who are taking advantage of it, but also the media who is presenting it to a lot of people who are watching online or watching on TV or even on streaming and being presented to them that way. How does that change the way that fans relate to sports? And when you go to watch a game, whether it's in the stadium or whether it's just sitting and watching it on your TV, like how does it change the experience of that game and the enjoyment out of it? Like, is it more annoying because all the sports betting is there? Or does it feel like, oh, I have this new opportunity to engage with it because now there are all these new stats that are being presented to me and I can maybe make some money? Like, what's the shift there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's profound, right? Because you just hear about it all the time. Like I go to the Knicks with some frequency here. I watch sports a lot out too. And like, you're just overhearing people talking about betting all the time or prop bets that they've made. And I think one point I overlooked earlier is the other aspect of it as well, which is that the leagues have been obsessed too with essentially another kind of cliff, which is just that Gen Z or sort of younger people are much less inclined to like watch full games, right? So there have been all these kind of crazy proposals, particularly in soccer, for how to deal with it. And I think the chairman of Real Madrid was talking about we need to make soccer more like Fortnite or something. And what the hell does that mean? But, I think it's particularly, sports leagues saw this as a way to sort of keep young men on board. And I think it's worked to at least some extent. But yeah, you're constantly hearing about prop bets, right? People are constantly just talking about this. And I think the thing that I've noticed, which has affected my ability to enjoy it, is like there's a real brittleness, I guess, that's kind of crept in. Like people are just pissed off all the time. Prop bets are hard. Like they're really difficult to do. I mean, just to explain, a prop bet is essentially a series of bets, right? So when you think about betting, you think about, I'm going to bet on a team to win, right? I'll put $10 on the New York Rangers to beat the Buffalo Sabres. And again, that actually tends to be a better bet for sportsbooks tend to make less money on it. Prop bets, you can theoretically make more money, but they're harder to hit. And so the companies really aggressively push prop bets because that's where most of their money comes from. And that is essentially, you're making a series of bets. So they all have to hit for you to win. So ordinarily, if to use my Rangers and Sabres thing, let's say the Rangers, the Rangers have a 1.5 to 1 chance to, or 2 to 1 chance to make it simpler to win. I put down $20, right? Then they win, you get whatever. But with a prop bet, it will be a series of things. So it might be that the Rangers win and that, some guy scores a goal and some guy gets in a fight or gets a foul or something. And then when you do that, like if all three of those things hit, technically the odds are better, right? You take a bet that was 2 to 1 and it's now 18 to 1, right? So your $20 becomes $350 basically. But like that never works. And like people are just talking about this all the time. And then the other aspect of it as well is people are like yelling at the players. You know what I mean? Like they want, to use the example, Alex Ovechkin to score a goal or somebody to do something. And like they're furious when it doesn't happen. I think, especially because of the amount of alcohol in particular that's involved in sports watching, I think you see this kind of extension. And there's been a real interesting, I think, rise right now. And you see with social media too. I think that the players themselves hate it, right? Because people are just yelling at them about their bets. They open Twitter or whatever, and people are yelling about their bets. And I think social media was already bad, right? Because it turns everyone into a heckler and a troll, but it's become significantly worse. And again, because people are like, you cost me $200 or whatever.
I was reading in the Wall Street Journal that the point guard for the Indiana Pacers, Tyrese Halliburton, said that he was talking to a sports psychologist because of the negativity on social media, because so many people were placing prop bets on him and of course then losing money and then, getting really angry. The head coach of the Cleveland Cavaliers said that he was getting texts from people because, again, they were losing money and they were angry. Apparently this is a big problem in college football and stuff like that as well. Yeah, it's a real shift to, I guess, the way that people engage with the game, because now you're not just going to watch it or not sitting on your couch to watch it and enjoy it, but now it's a way that you're making money, or more often, I guess, losing money, and much more common than in the past. Again, because you're saying you could often bet anyway, but it would have been more difficult. The prop betting in particular, is that something that is like made more common and easier to do because it's all on apps instead of, some other more traditional way of betting on the games?
It's a couple of things. I think one is just that you could always place prop bet, like I would go to Vegas and place prop bets on stuff before, right? And because they are fun, but the reason why they're so common is I think kind of similar. I think one is it's a sort of lottery system, right? So it's not as big of an accomplishment. You don't get as much money if you just, bet the money line or you just bet on one team to win. It creates, I think, a sense that there's an extraordinary amount of money to be made somehow or somewhere. But again, the big reason is just that they're really hard to hit. And most of the time you lose, right? And you might lose by one rebound or one steal or, a foul or a couple free throws. And that I think makes people furious. But the reason why they're being pushed is just because that's where they make their money, right? So, if you're just betting the line, particularly just the money line or something, you're not going to make a ton of money, but you have like a 30% chance of essentially winning. I think that number goes down to 10 or lower with prop bet. And, when you multiply this by several million bets or, whatever you want to call it, several tens of billions of dollars, it's a ton of money. So the sports books themselves really, really, really push prop bets. And that was the thing as well. Like there are a lot of like sports podcasts I listened to for a while, and they would do a prop bet at the end. You know what I mean? Like, they'd be sponsored by a casino or something, but that would be part of it as well. And I think, to go back to the earlier conversation, sports always make people mad, right? Like, I get mad about sports all the time. I'm sure I have a cracked phone from the Buffalo Bills losing in the playoffs, even though I knew they were going to lose. But I think what you've seen, I think, and this gets to part of the other problem as well, is like, at least theoretically, they also exist as a way to form some kind of social bond with other people, and you're sharing the same experience, right? And that experience is theoretically like, I want the Knicks to win, right? I want Liverpool Football Club to win. And prop bets, I think, erode that sense of solidarity, right? Like in that sense of communal enjoyment, right? Because you have this kind of individual financial relationship with the game, whereas before, I'm from Elmira, New York, so I like the Bills, I like the Knicks, right? I'm Irish and depressed, so I like Liverpool. And in this instance, what you're seeing is the degradation of that. And I think that's one of the things that really hits me, is like, it kind of creates this atomization of sports fandom itself, where all of a sudden you're not just invested in the Knicks winning. The Knicks have to win, and Josh Hart has to hit more than 3.5 3-pointers and get 2 steals. And that sucks. Like, it's stupid. And again, like, it creates the other issue as well, which is, I think, one reason that I like sports too, is like, I look at this thing all the time, right? Like, and it is one of the few things that I can just engage with, like, on a kind of psychic level. And like, yeah, every now and then I'll tweet something stupid during it. But for the most part, like, I want to watch them. I want to hang out with my friends. I want to experience a kind of social bond. And you see that cracking, I think, with the rise of betting. And again, too, also with the larger infection of sports gambling here too, where it's like, you're never just experiencing the game anymore, right? You're also being reminded of what's the line, you know what I mean? And how can you make money on it? And, are the Mets going to get more than 6.5 runs? And that sucks.
Yeah, it absolutely does.
Yeah.
Even as someone who like is not someone who really watches sports, but to hear you describe it, like, I'd be super disappointed if, there was something that I really loved and I was seeing this kind of change happen to it, right? Where kind of this communal aspect, this kind of aspect of, enjoying it with other people was being eroded because people want to make more money off of it, basically. I feel like hearing what you're saying too, it sounds like the prop bets also take advantage of people's love of the game and people's feeling of the expertise, right? Because they're watching it so much, they're paying attention to the players. They're like, oh, I know this person can do this, so I'm going to put some money on it. And then, it doesn't happen, and they feel like that person has like betrayed them personally or something.
Yeah. And I think there's another thing too, which is like part of it as well, which kind of, there's a FOMO element as well, right? Or like, there's an infection of kind of like hustle culture, right? That's like, you should be making money while you're watching this game. And if you're not betting, like, you're not doing it right. And that's like the way that it gets pushed on you all the time. I think that's like one of the things that really makes me recoil, is that I think it like exploits the kind of, whatever you want to call it, crisis in masculinity or something, and people's economic precariousness as well, where you're just like, yeah, it's giving you a sense that this thing that, again, was like, you think about the way that these teams started for the most part, like, there are sources of local and regional identity and pride. And that's not really true in like the era of mass culture anymore, but it still exists to some extent. And I think there's been a real erosion in that too. And it's like the games themselves are seen as just another way for you to make money, to rise and grind. And like, you're getting ripped off when you do it too.
Yeah. I wanted to pivot away from talking about the fans and kind of their experience of this to talk about the players itself, because I feel like one of the things I picked up from the piece that you wrote was that there's a growing number of scandals around the players' engagement with sports betting and what it's doing to that side of things. I was reading in the Wall Street Journal that the NFL had to suspend 10 players for betting last year, and the NBA has had a growing number of complaints from players and head coaches about the influence of betting. And it seems in particular this scandal around Los Angeles Dodgers Shohei Ohtani has really blown up recently. Can you tell us what that has been all about and what it says about the influence of betting when it comes to the players as well?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you see it kind of everywhere. So the Ohtani scandal is a goofy one. So he's a Japanese player. He doesn't speak English. He just signed this like massive, I think it's a $700 million contract with the Los Angeles Dodgers. He's an amazing player. He's the best player in baseball and is sort of like this baseball savior kind of. He pitches, he hits, he does both things extraordinarily well. But he's also this kind of weird cipher. Like, no one knows anything about him. Like, people didn't know what his dog's name was for a long time. It was revealed like when he signed with the Dodgers, he got married and he was just like, hey, I'm married now. And everyone was like, well, to who? And they found out like 48 hours later. And, part of that's just he's a private guy, but also, he is essentially everything that he did was mediated through this translator who was also his best friend. And then basically it happened very quickly. It was a weekday evening and the Dodgers fired the translator and kind of nobody knew why. And then quickly it became clear that Ohtani's account had sent $4.5 million to a guy who was running an illegal sports book in Anaheim or somewhere in Southern California. And, the question was immediately like, well, is Ohtani betting on baseball, right? There's famously the Pete Rose scandal in the 1970s, 1980s that, ultimately led to Pete Rose, who is the most hits of any player ever, being banned from baseball and from entering the Hall of Fame. Going back even further, there was the scandal in 1919, which resulted in 8 players who were banned forever for throwing the World Series because of the mafia involvement. There's a good John Sayles movie, 8 Men Out. That's about that. So there was this concern. It does seem like what happened was actually that the translator was a gambling addict and did steal this money from Ohtani. He's facing federal charges now for doing that. But I think that raised the salience of this issue. There in basketball, you had another situation where this guy, Jonte Porter, who plays for the Toronto Raptors, he's the scrub, end of the bench player. But, it seems like what was happening was that he was in this kind of Discord chat or WhatsApp group, I think Discord chat, with a bunch of guys. And they would say, look, play a little bit and then call out sick. And they would place these kind of prop bets on him getting less than 4 rebounds, less than 1 3-pointer, right? And this was flagged by, I think, FanDuel, maybe DraftKings, maybe both, because they were like, oh, we're seeing the biggest payout that they did for these 2 games that he allegedly did this. We're on prop bets made on this guy who plays, 6 minutes a game for the Raptors and who stinks. His brother's a freak too, but that's a whole other subject. But his brother's good. And, you've also seen this in European soccer. So in Europe is interesting because they've had legal sports betting for much longer. And you can really see this, if you go to a place like Blackpool in England or something, you see societal rot in which sports gambling is playing a major role. Like I've been wandering around there and you just see kind of dead-eyed people. But there's a player, Ivan Toney, who plays for Brentford, who was suspended for I think for 8 months. Because when he was in the lower league, he had placed hundreds of bets. There's a big scandal in Italy, essentially, in which 3 of their best young players, who I think had all played together, also had placed hundreds of bets. One of them plays at Juventus, had lost like over $1 million. Tonali has been banned, I think, for over a year. He's going to miss the European Championships this summer. And it was found out recently, or at least alleged recently, that he had continued to bet on sports even after he had been suspended. And there are a couple of things here, right? I think there's a needle to thread. And I think when you talk to people who are defensive of the gambling industry, what they will say for the most part is like, oh, well, these companies like flag these bets, right? You saw that with Jonte Porter. And like the Tonali bets, they were made via illegal like apps. And, they say, well, those are illegal bets, right? The players aren't supposed to bet on themselves anyways. So, but I think you're seeing 2 things. One is a question about the integrity of sports themselves. And I think it's probably likely that Jonte Porter will get a lifetime ban just to be made an example of. Tonali, again, is going to miss out on 2 years of what is essentially his prime or close to it. I mean, he's young, but he's a very, very good midfielder. And, it's because sports are trying to protect the integrity of the game. But I think what people overlook here is that the target demographic for sports gambling is essentially men in their 20s, right? And like, athletes are men in their 20s for the most part, and they are going to get caught up in the same types of societal rot that other people are, like Sandro Tonali is probably a gambling addict, right? Ivan Toney probably has a gambling problem. To move it into an even bigger picture, the thing that's interesting about Ivan Toney is that he plays for Brentford FC. Brentford is owned by a professional gambler. They are sponsored by a gambling company. And you create this weird world in which the players rightfully are banned from betting because it screws up the question of, is this real, right? Are the players trying to win? But everywhere they look, right? Like Ivan Toney, when he came back from being suspended for gambling, would look down on his shirt and it says Hollywood Bets, right? Like, and you're being just reminded all the time, just bombarded, right? The sides of the stadium are Paddy Power ads. But usually that's certainly the case in some parts of Europe too, or William Hill or whatever they have there. And I think that that's the sort of like larger hypocrisy question here. Obviously, the integrity problem is a big one. And I think it's one that the leagues are trying to solve by dishing out, pretty severe punishments to players to try to make examples of them. But like gambling is an addiction, right? Like with the exception of the Porter scandal, which is pretty minor, there hasn't been anything major that I've seen that suggests that there's been anything that's really screwed up, like in the way that the 1919 World Series was literally thrown by the mafia. But you see it in all these other little ways, right? And again, it's being done just for stupid reasons. So people make money, or even just that they feel like they have a sense of control. And I don't really know what they can do about it. I mean, I think to some extent there's going to be a huge rise of just enforcement. And I'm sure that the teams are going to be monitoring what their players are doing as well to an extent. But like at the end of the day, these are guys in their 20s. Like guys in their 20s gamble, and they gamble because everywhere they look, they're told to gamble. It's become a societal norm. They want to be a part of this thing. I have people in my family that have gambling problems or have had gambling problems. And again, I think, how you control that is an interesting question. But yeah, I think what we're seeing, and I don't know how it stops, essentially. It's like you're seeing a slow just increase in minor. I think there's still relatively minor scandals. I mean, Ivan Toney, Sandro Tonali, these guys may have bet hundreds of times, but like Toney never bet on a game he was playing in. Tonali, there have been some allegations that he may have picked up a stupid yellow card here and there for gambling reasons, but it's not something that affects the outcome. But I think what you're seeing is you introduce poison into the ecosystem, into the water, right? Everyone drinks the water, and that's going to include players who are involved in this too.
Yeah. So I guess the bigger issue or the bigger concern is less them using insider knowledge from the sport to make their own bets, but rather starting to change how they play because they have relationships with people who can place bets and are going to make money off of that because of it, I guess.
Yeah. I think that's probably the larger concern at this point. I mean, they have very protected inside information. It's proprietary, right? Like there's a guy who got arrested for stealing information. This is not gambling related, but who works for the Timberwolves, right? And you see things like leak out with like lineups and other things like that can affect gambling, right? Or like I like to play a fantasy Premier League or something, and like I always get mad because some guys know who's playing and who's not, beforehand. And I don't know that. And that doesn't matter because it's free and doesn't really affect anything. It's 100% possible that you will see some sort of major event that is skewed, in favor of gambling interest at some point. But I think what you're more likely to see is just like a 1,000 cuts scenario in which, every now and then it's the Jonte Porters of the world that I think are probably more concerning, right? Because they might just want to be cool. They might want to feel like they're participating in something, but also like, Jonte Porter's on a couple of 10-day contracts for the Raptors. Like his brother's got $100 million or whatever, but he's making more than me, but not a lot. And I think that, it's an opportunity for them to cash out too. And I think that shouldn't be overlooked either.
That makes a lot of sense. When you were talking about the broader impacts and, what the players were doing and how they're still in their 20s as well, and they have these same kind of pressures and wants to, do this gambling like anyone else, I think that gets us into the bigger question that your piece was really getting to, when you called this sports betting, sports gambling, to be very clear about what it was and the broader impacts of having these gambling ads everywhere. Every time you see sports, you see these encouragements to place a bet or place a bunch of bets when we're talking about prop bets on different things that are happening in the sport, and how that pushes this greater prevalence of gambling within society. And of course, this addiction to gambling, because then you lose some money and then you want to try to make it back, and you're constantly making more and more bets. So talk to us a bit about that aspect of this, how by legalizing sports betting, you now have a lot more people who are engaging in this gambling, getting addicted to it, and the crisis that causes in their lives.
The extent to which it's normalized as well is like, and I think like binge drinking is a reasonable comp here too, right? And that it's like, you look at the way that Budweiser is marketed or something. It's like you hang out with your friends, you drink a bunch of beer or whatever. Don't you want to hang out with your friends and drink a bunch of beer? Gambling has a similarly kind of insidious, like soft marketing side to it, right? It's just like, oh, don't you want to just hang out at the bar with your boys and bet on college football or whatever? And what you've seen really quickly is just a huge explosion in addiction, which is not surprising at all because it's so easy, right? Like it used to be you would still have to do something, right? Like you would have to get money. You would have to call somebody. You'd have to give the money to somebody else. You have to, usually you'd have to get in your car.
There was some like friction in the process of placing the bet.
Yeah, exactly. And I think now you have a situation in which there is no friction at all. And that's, I think, a huge, huge problem. So it's still pretty early, but there are states, I think, particularly in the Northeast, that have been really good at studying this. So New Jersey was the first state to legalize sports betting, and they've essentially seen a steady climb in calls to gambling addiction hotlines over the last 5 years. In Connecticut, they legalized gambling in 2021. They saw a 91% increase in calls to gambling addiction hotlines. There was a paper that came out that I thought was really interesting late last month, or I think on April 1st, actually, from the University of New Mexico, that essentially found extremely high rates of correlation between binge drinking and sports gambling, which is not surprising. But I think, again, too, it's one of the things that's overlooked here is like that's also the way that it's kind of sold as well, right? That this is the thing you go out and you do. You go to the bar and you place bets. And again, I think like you're just seeing, you look at the credit crunch right now, that's an inflation problem more than anything else. But I think that it's also true that people are looking for magic ways to get more money, and sports gambling, really, really, really aggressively markets itself as a kind of way out. I was having a conversation with somebody over the weekend. Like the way it works is you lose money and then you're like, well, the way I can get this money back is it's easy. It's place another bet, right? And you just get trapped in that cycle really quickly. And like the bets hit sometimes, some of the bets work.
You need to occasionally win to keep coming back, right?
Yeah. But like overall, you lose, right? And I think that the way it works with your brain is a kind of similar thing, that it gives you a sense of control over these kinds of events, and you feel like, okay, if something bad happens, I can make something good happen just by picking up my phone and clicking a couple buttons. And it's that type of sort of vicious cycle that I think is ensnaring a lot of people. And again, like the companies are just extremely aggressive in the way that they sort of onboard people. I think there's going to be a point. I don't think it's, a situation in which there will be exponential growth forever in terms of sports gambling, but there's a huge amount of market capture here. And like the apps themselves claim that they're good at flagging problem bettors, but like, at the point that you're flagging a problem better too, it's, maybe too late for somebody as well. And again, some of them accept credit cards, which is insane to me. And it's just a completely screwed up system in which, you can ruin your life with, a couple of stupid bets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I've read as well, you were talking earlier about how a lot of these apps, I don't know if they still do it, but would basically say you can kind of have like free money to start getting into it. And then once you do sign up for the app, once you're into it, especially when you're watching one of the games, you're constantly getting these notifications to like place additional bets on things that are happening as you're watching. So like, we know with Facebook and the social media platforms and the way that many of these apps have been designed over a long period of time to use these push notifications to get you to come back and even learn from gambling techniques in order to design their systems. It's no surprise then to see gambling apps that are designed to get you to bet on these games, and I'm sure things beyond that as well, to use these same tactics to get you to come back, to get you engaged in the system, to make sure that they're keeping you engaged and spending money, essentially.
I like sports radio too, but it plays on a kind of similar impulse, right? Which is that people want to feel like they understand they have some sort of mastery over these systems and the games themselves. And I think that that's the other way that prop bets work too, is that it's like a la carte, right? Like you're kind of not just doing the same thing that everybody else is, right? So when one works, you have this special, it's because you have special knowledge of, I don't know why I keep using Josh Hart as an example, but whatever, New York Knicks swingman, Josh Hart. And I think that that's part of it as well, right? Is that what it's selling to you is the sense that you understand what's happening right now. And like, you don't, like the casinos know, like they're really good. The handful of times I've done prop bets on DraftKings, FanDuel, like you're just like, oh yeah, they're usually, they're not far off, right? Like when they say 4.5 rebounds, they mean 4.5 rebounds, right? Like, you're probably going to miss a prop bet by 1 or 2. And that I think is the other element of this, right? Is that you may hit 2 of the 3 in a prop bet, right? But like you're going to miss by just a hair. And that near miss feeling is actually like the thing that makes you kind of hooked, because you're like, I was this close, but I can get it next time because like I got it, right? Like I figured out the points, assists, rebounds, but you're always going to be this close because they have large computers that are running huge numbers of simulations to figure these things out, I assume. But however they're doing it, like they're usually very good. You're not going to beat the casino. Like that's the whole thing. Only Donald Trump can lose money running a casino. And and I think that that's a big part of it, right? It's just that. And again, like it's almost impossible to watch anything without there being some reminder, right? Like the American soccer coverage is a little bit less than most, but even there, it'll just be like the odds, the odds for Liverpool, Arsenal, Manchester City to win the title right now, and you're just kind of like, they're all 1 point away from each other, right? Like, of course, the bookies think Manchester City's going to win because they won it for the last 5 years, right? So it doesn't really tell you anything. Like, that's the thing that makes me crazy about it. Is I'm just like, I'm not learning anything useful here. What I'm being told is just like, what if you bet on this right now? You know what I mean? Liverpool's plus 450, right?
Definitely. When you think about the broader impacts of it, as you were describing, with so many more people calling into these gambling hotlines, and just, the fact that the economy itself is not in the greatest place right now. A lot of people are struggling in the sense that, because we're in this inflation crisis, because the cost of everything has gone up so much, because people's mortgages have gone up so much, there is this just kind of like general stress that companies like this can take advantage of in saying, hey, you need a bit more money, try placing one of these bets. And then, of course, naturally, when they lose many of those bets and lose a lot of money, you end up in this spiral. And in your piece, you talk about the connection between gambling addiction and then, substance abuse and alcohol abuse and binge drinking and things like that. And it's completely understandable how that happens, right? Because you can already be in this desperate situation. Then you're even more strapped for cash because these bets have failed. And then, of course, you start drinking more because, I'm in this terrible place, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think like there's another possibility too, which is just that if you're predisposed to high risk behavior, then being introduced to another easy way to do high risk behavior. And if you're engaged in something that, for instance, decreases your sense of inhibition or your ability to manage risk, or even your ability to really look at things in a longer term, which is essentially what's the appeal of alcoholism to some extent, to the extent that it has an appeal. It's sort of all of the above, right? But again, the larger situation is like, again, I go back and forth on it, right? Like in some ways, alcohol is a really good example in that most people can just have a glass of wine or whatever, or 2 glasses of wine, sometimes 3 glasses of wine, and they're fine. But there are other people that if you have 1 glass of wine, then you're going to have 15, 15 glasses of wine. That would be horrible for the sugar intake, but whatever. And I think that, the problem here for me is also just like the phone element, right? Like it just makes it, again, too, you at least still have to go out and buy a bunch of wine or a bunch of beer or whatever you want. And here it's just so easy to get hooked on it and to be just trapped there once you get there, that I think it's really, really dangerous. And there's nothing to be done. So,
yeah. And on that point, obviously, we're talking about how a lot of state governments, governments kind of legalized this over the past number of years after the Supreme Court decision because they saw the opportunity of the revenue that came with it. And I'm sure, they were being lobbied by the companies that want it to be legalized so they can, make their money on sports betting. Have we seen, as these potential impacts have been growing, as states like, as you were talking about, as states have seen calls to these gambling addiction hotlines increase significantly since the legalization of sports betting, has there been any move to try to rein this in or at least place some rules around how it works?
No, no, not at all. You're not really seeing anything like that, I think, like anywhere. I mean, I was doing a sort of cursory search earlier. No, I mean, I think the problem with it is like, in the same sense we've been talking about this kind of vicious cycle that leads to gambling addiction, like there's a kind of, it may sound crass, but there's like a virtuous cycle that has led to the spread of this, right? Or virtuous if you are making money off of it, right? Which is that obviously betting interests spend a ton of money to make sure that they can legalize gambling everywhere because they make a lot of money, and states are strapped for money, and you can tax this heavily, maybe you don't have to pass a, tax levy or something because you're getting more revenue from gambling. And, that was like why New Jersey wanted to do it. And sports leagues are looking at a very, very uncertain future. I think that that's something that's been kind of undercovered recently, but they had been pitching themselves to owners as essentially a font of unlimited growth. They're going to take over the world, and there's going to be cable revenue and everything else. And like they're seeing that dry up. So they're looking at other places too. And gambling provides a window there. And again, as I was saying before, I think that they're also, I think, extremely anxious about, the TikTok generation or whatever. And this is a way that you can literally capture people into watching sports. And then there's sports media too, which is similarly in pretty deep trouble because it's media and it's everything else. And it's very quickly reorienting itself and pushing gambling stuff. And you see, they're just huge. If you go to The Athletic, that's a great example. Like, it's just gambling stuff all over it. Advertisements are gambling. There are just tips about gambling. And again, like part of that, again, is that's what your readers want and you're providing it to them. But I think for all of those entities, all of which need money, or at least want money very much, but like this has been a real boon. And, it's relatively undercovered still. And again, if you look at places like Europe and England in particular, there's a lot of really good writing and has been, particularly in The Guardian, which has been very good about sports gambling, that drills in on just the societal impact that the Premier League in particular, that its, embrace of gambling has had on British society, which was, mess before anyways, but they haven't done anything there either. Right. And I think here as well, like it's sort of being treated like any other kind of, addiction problem, which is that it just kind of gets swept under the rug, right? Like, and it's like alcoholism or something as well. You're not going to see a prohibition. It's crazy that was ever a constitutional amendment, but like that era is long gone. And again, I think that like for the states, it's free money. And I think they're not thinking about it, in terms of the larger societal cost as well. Like there is an actual cost to both the societal fabric, but also an economic cost too. And that's not being considered here either. But I think, again, it can be a problem, but Joe Biden wants young men to vote for him, right? Donald Trump wants young men to vote for him. They're not going to be like, sports gambling is terrible, right? Like it's not a winning political issue in that way. People like sports gambling. They're not concerned about the other problems, in part because I think, that's a part of the larger discussion we're having. It's an atomization issue, right? Gambling addiction is something that happens to other people. But like the ultimate result here for me is a situation in which everything is being degraded, right? Like the sports are being degraded. The societal fabric is being degraded. You're constantly just being told to do things that cost money, that are outside of the actual enjoyment that you get from something. You're getting further and further away from the sense of connection and joy and pain and whatever you feel from watching sports. And it's being replaced by a sort of synthetic version of that I think is really gross.
Yeah, I think that's an essential point that, obviously we're seeing far beyond sports and in many other parts of society. Yeah, and the only thing I was trying to look up any kind of initiatives to try to rein this in, and the only thing that I saw was the College Sport League, NCAA, kind of trying to push to stop player-specific bets, and a few states have done that, but that's about it. Alex, this has been a sobering, not particularly positive conversation. It hasn't told us the world is getting better or anything, but I think it is good to understand the impact of this, what it's actually doing. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show. Thanks so much.
Yeah, it was great to talk to you. Take care.
Alex Shephard is a senior editor at The New Republic. Tech Won't Save Us is made in partnership with The Nation magazine and is hosted by me, Paris Marx. Production is by Eric Wickham and transcripts are by Brigitte Pawliw-Fry. Tech Won't Save Us relies on the support of listeners like you to keep providing critical perspectives on the tech industry. You can join hundreds of other supporters by going to patreon.com/techwon'tsave us and making a pledge of your own. Thanks for listening, and make sure to come back next week.